They never feared your strength, they feared your silence. Because silence is where truth starts breathing and lies start panicking. The moment you stopped explaining yourself, their control started collapsing. You didn't argue. You didn't chase approval. You just stepped back into your own mind. And that's dangerous, more dangerous than anger, more dangerous than revenge. Because a person who no longer reacts becomes unrateable, and unrateable means unbreakable. They depended on your weakness to feel powerful, to feel in control of your direction. But now, your quiet presence is doing what noise never could, exposing everything underneath, and they can feel it creeping in. That uncomfortable realization that you're no longer easy to manipulate. Silence is not emptiness. It is a shift in power that most people fail to understand until it is too late. When you stop responding the way they expect, when you stop feeding their need for reaction, you remove the very fuel that kept their control alive. People who depend on your weakness do not fear your words. They fear your absence of them. Because words can be twisted, debated, and countered, but silence cannot be negotiated with. It simply exists, and in that existence it starts changing the entire structure of the game without making a sound. Every system of control relies on predictable reactions. Anger, explanation, defense, apology. These are all forms of participation. The moment you engage, you are still inside their framework. They win not because they are stronger, but because you are still responding. Silence changes that equation completely. It refuses to participate. It steps outside the script. And when someone who was supposed to be predictable becomes unpredictable, fear doesn't come from what they are doing, but from what they are no longer doing. Silence begins to create space where certainty used to exist. That space feels uncomfortable to those who relied on your emotional reactions to define their position. They were used to pushing a button and getting a reaction. Now the button does nothing, and in that nothing, their confidence starts to collapse. They begin to question if they ever had control at all, or if it was just your willingness to respond that created the illusion of it. What makes silence powerful is that it does not attack, yet it destabilizes everything built on expectation. It does not argue, yet it exposes every weak assumption they depended on. It does not defend itself, yet it forces others to confront their own assumptions without resistance to push against. And when there is nothing to push against, people begin to feel their own imbalance. Those who once relied on your weakness to feel superior start to notice something disturbing. The version of you they could predict is gone. The emotional reactions they once triggered no longer appear. People know, and without those reactions, they are left standing in front of something they cannot rid. Human nature fears what it cannot read. It tries to interpret, to decode, to regain control through understanding. But silence offers nothing to decode. It is clean, neutral, and unreachable. The more you remain silent, the more their dependence becomes visible. They start filling the silence with their own assumptions, their own fears, their own projections. And slowly, they realize the control they thought they had was never real. It was borrowed from your response. Without your response, their influence has no anchor. Silence does not need to prove power. It reveals it. And in that revelation, the entire structure built on your weakness begins to lose its shape. Without a single confrontation, without a single argument, without a single sound. Weakness is never just an emotion, it is an entry point. A silent door left slightly open in the mind, waiting for someone observant enough to step inside without force. People don't always dominate you with strength. Sometimes they do it by studying where you bend, where you hesitate, where you explain too much. That is where dependence begins. Not in power, but in access. And once someone learns your access points, they know you're the real deal. Oh, they don't need to break you. They only need to press the right place and watch you move on command. Those who depend on your weakness are not always enemies in the obvious sense. They can be people who smile, who listen, who pretend to understand you. But behind that understanding, they are mapping reactions. Every emotional response becomes information. Every apology becomes permission. Every hesitation becomes proof that control is possible. And slowly, without loud confrontation, they build a quiet structure around your reactions. Not chains you can see, but patterns you repeat without noticing. Weakness becomes powerful in their hands not because it is large, but because it is predictable. Predictability is the real currency of control. When they know what will make you speak, what will make you defend yourself, what will make you chase clarity, they no longer need to force anything. They simply guide the situation and let your own emotions complete the rest. And the most dangerous part is not that they are controlling you, but that you begin to believe your reactions are your own decisions. They depend on your weakness because it gives them stability. As long as you respond, they feel anchored. As long as you explain, they feel informed. As long as you react, they feel powerful. Your emotional availability becomes their tool of certainty. Without it, they are left guessing. And guessing is something controllers cannot tolerate. So they keep you in cycles, small provocations, subtle triggers, familiar pressures, just enough to keep your responses alive. But weakness is not always something forced on you. Sometimes it is something you offer without realizing. The need to be understood, the need to be validated, the need to fix misunderstandings immediately. These become soft points in your structure, and once identified, they are no longer weaknesses in your eyes, but instruments in theirs. They don't attack your strength. They bypass it entirely and work through your emotional reflexes. The dependence grows quietly. They start to rely on your reactions to define their position. If you respond strongly, they feel powerful. If you respond emotionally, they feel in control. If you remain uncertain, they feel dominant. Your internal state becomes their external advantage. And over time, they stop seeing you as a whole person and start seeing you as a system of responses they can activate. But what they never fully calculate is that weakness loses its function when it is no longer exposed. The moment access is removed, the structure collapses inward, because dependence cannot survive without input. And when your reactions stop feeding the system begins to reveal itself for what it really was: not authority, not superiority, but an arrangement built entirely on what you were willing to reveal without realizing. Reaction is the currency of control, and silence is the moment that bankrupts it. As long as you respond, you are still participating in the system that was designed around your emotions. Every reaction you give, whether it is anger, explanation, defense, or even confusion, feeds the structure that depends on your predictability. Control does not always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like timing. The timing of when you speak, when you explain yourself, when you try to fix what was never broken in the first place. And the more consistent your reactions become, the easier it is for others to shape the outcome without ever needing to force anything. No reaction means no entry point. It removes the bridge between intention and manipulation. Because manipulation does not work in isolation, it requires participation. Someone has to respond for it to succeed. When you stop reacting, the entire mechanism loses its function. Words lose direction. Triggers lose effect. Situations that were designed to pull you into emotional engagement suddenly fall flat, as if they were never aimed correctly in the first place. People who depend on your reactions are not always aware that they are dependent. They may think they are simply interacting, simply communicating, simply expressing themselves. But underneath that surface, there is an expectation that you will respond in a certain way. That expectation is what gives them a sense of control. When it is met, they feel aligned with the situation. When it is not, they feel a disruption they cannot immediately name, and that disruption slowly turns into discomfort. No reaction is not weakness. It is interruption. It interrupts the rhythm that others rely on to position themselves around you. When someone pushes a button expecting movement and gets nothing, they are forced to confront something they did not plan for: absence of validation. And absence is louder than resistance, because resistance still confirms engagement. Silence does not confirm anything. It leaves no evidence of participation, no emotional trace to follow, no angle to continue from. This is where control begins to collapse quietly. The person trying to influence the situation starts adjusting their approach. They repeat themselves. They increase intensity. They search for a response that no longer arrives. And in that search, their own dependence becomes visible, because now they are not controlling you. They are chasing your reaction. And chasing is the opposite of control. The power of no reaction lies in its refusal to complete the circuit. Every manipulative interaction is a circuit waiting to close stimulus, response, validation. Break the response, and the circuit remains open, unfinished, exposed, and what remains unfinished cannot be used. It becomes wasted effort, miscalculated intention, emotional noise with no receiver. Those who once relied on your emotional availability begin to experience uncertainty. Not because you have become aggressive, not because you have confronted them, but because you have stopped completing the pattern they depended on. And when patterns fail, people begin to question their own influence. They start wondering if they ever had control, or if control was simply your willingness to respond all along. No reaction is not absence of power. It is the removal of permission for others to define your emotional state, permission for others to set your rhythm, permission for others to turn your responses into their structure of certainty. Without that permission, their system does not adapt. It dissolves quietly into confusion that has nowhere to go. Emotional distance is not escape. It is elevation beyond reach. It is the moment you stop standing where everyone expects you to stand, emotionally available, emotionally readable, emotionally predictable. People are comfortable with proximity when it comes to your emotions. Not physical proximity, but psychological closeness. The kind where they can sense your reaction before you even speak. That closeness creates influence, and influence, once established, does not need force. It only needs consistency. Power does not always grow through confrontation. In fact, confrontation often drains it. Emotional distance grows in silence, in restraint, in the refusal to be pulled into every situation that demands your immediate reaction. When you are emotionally close, every word from others becomes a lever. Every situation becomes a trigger point. Every misunderstanding becomes a battlefield where your energy is expected to prove something. But when distance is introduced, those levers stop working. The triggers remain, but the response weakens. And without response, control loses its shape. People who once depended on your emotional availability start noticing something unfamiliar. You are still present, but not accessible in the same way. You are still there, but not inside their reach of influence. This creates confusion first, because systems built on emotional access do not immediately understand absence of reaction. They are designed for engagement, not withdrawal. So they try harder at first, expecting the old pattern to return. They increase intensity, repeat familiar behaviors, attempt to pull you back into emotional proximity. But emotional distance does not respond to pressure. It does not increase or decrease based on external demand. It exists as a boundary that is not announced, not argued, not defended. It simply remains. And in that remaining, it changes everything. Because now their attempts are no longer shaping your internal state. They are only revealing their dependence on your response. Emotional distance creates a mirror effect. What others project toward you no longer transforms into reaction, it reflects back as unanswered intent. And when intent is not converted into reaction, it becomes visible in its raw form. People begin to see their own need for control more clearly, because there is no emotional feedback to disguise it anymore. No anger to justify engagement. No sadness to manipulate empathy. No confusion to invite explanation. The strength of emotional distance lies in its refusal to participate in emotional economies built by others. In those economies, your reactions were currency. Every response had value. Every emotional shift had meaning for someone else's sense of control. But distance removes currency from circulation. It stops transactions that were never consciously agreed upon. And when transactions stop, those who relied on them start experiencing withdrawal without understanding why. Over time, emotional distance reshapes perception. What once felt like accessibility now feels like unpredictability. What once felt like connection now feels like uncertainty. And uncertainty is where control weakens. Because control requires emotional readability, and emotional distance removes readability without explanation. Those who once depended on your closeness begin to realize that they are no longer interacting with your reactions, but with your boundaries. And boundaries do not negotiate in real time. They do not adjust to emotional pressure. They do not bend in response to expectation. They simply exist, and in that existence, they redefine the entire structure of interaction without needing acknowledgement from anyone observing it. When you disappear emotionally, people don't just lose access to you. They lose access to the version of themselves that depended on your reactions. Absence is not empty. It is a mirror that starts showing uncomfortable truths. As long as you were emotionally present, others could define their position through your responses. They could feel powerful when you reacted, reassured when you explained, in control when you tried to fix misunderstandings. Your presence gave structure to their behavior, even if they never admitted it. But the moment you step back, that structure starts collapsing quietly, because it was never built on them. It was built on your availability. Absence reveals dependence in a way confrontation never can. When you fight back, people can label it, argue with it, or resist it. But when you simply withdraw your emotional participation, there is nothing to fight against. Only silence where expectation used to live. And that silence begins to expose something most people are not ready to see. How much of their influence was actually borrowed from your reactions. They thought they were in control of you, but they were actually dependent on your emotional cooperation to maintain that illusion. When you are present and reactive, people can continue their patterns without questioning them. They know what response to expect, and that expectation becomes comfort. But when you withdraw, that comfort disappears. Now every action they take has no guaranteed outcome. Every message, every gesture, every attempt to trigger you lands in uncertainty, and uncertainty is uncomfortable for anyone who relied on predictable emotional feedback. Absence does not shout. It does not argue. It does not defend itself. It simply stops completing the cycle that others relied on. And in that unfinished cycle, their behavior becomes visible in its raw form. Without your reaction to balance it, their intentions stand alone, exposed without emotional cover. What once looked like communication now feels like dependence trying to reach for something that is no longer responding. People often underestimate how much meaning they were extracting from your responses. A single reaction from you could validate their position, reinforce their sense of importance, or confirm their ability to affect you. That validation creates attachment, even if it is hidden behind conflict or manipulation, because emotional influence does not always feel like love or connection. It can feel like power, attention, or control. And once someone gets used to that feedback loop, absence feels like loss of identity rather than loss of interaction. When you become absent in that emotional sense, you are no longer feeding the loop. And without that feed, the loop starts to malfunction. The same tactics that once worked begin to fail. The same words that once triggered responses now fall into silence. And that silence is not neutral for them. It is destabilizing, because it forces them to operate without confirmation from you, without emotional reinforcement, without the predictable rhythm they built their expectations around. Absence also changes perception over time. People start filling the silence with their own assumptions. They begin to project meanings where there is none provided. They start questioning whether they ever had influence at all, or whether it was simply your willingness to respond that created the illusion of it. And that question alone is enough to shift the balance, because now their focus is no longer on controlling you, but on understanding why they no longer can. Absence is not retreat. It is the removal of emotional supply from systems that were never self-sustaining. And when supply is removed, what remains is not power, it is exposure, waiting in silence for a response that no longer arrives. There is a strange kind of power in being unreadable, because control only survives where understanding is easy. When people can read you, they can predict you. When they can predict you, they can position themselves around you. And when they can position themselves around you, they begin to feel like they own the rhythm of your reactions. But an unreadable mind removes that comfort completely. It gives nothing to interpret with certainty, Nothing stable enough to hold on to, nothing consistent enough to build influence on. Unreadability is not chaos. It is controlled absence of clarity. It is the decision to stop broadcasting emotional signals that others have been using as maps. Because every reaction you've becomes a reference point in someone else's strategy. Every emotional response becomes data, and over time, that data forms expectations. Expectations turn into assumptions. Assumptions turn into control attempts that feel justified from the outside, even when they are not. But when you become unreadable, that entire system loses its foundation. People start trying to analyze patterns that no longer exist. They look for consistency where you have removed it. They search for emotional cues that you no longer provide. And in that search, they begin to reveal their own dependence more than your behavior. Because the effort to read you becomes more intense than the interaction itself. An unreadable mind does not argue against interpretation. It simply refuses to be completed by it. Others may try to define your intentions, your emotions, your next move, but every definition falls slightly short. And that gap between expectation and reality creates discomfort. Not because you are doing something aggressive, but because you are no longer confirming their assumptions. What makes unreadability powerful is that it forces others to operate without certainty. And humans are not comfortable without certainty, especially those who rely on emotional reactions to feel in control. When certainty disappears, they start overcompensating. They test more, they observe more closely. They try different approaches to trigger something familiar. But nothing familiar returns in the same way, because nothing is being offered in a predictable format anymore. An unreadable mind is not about hiding emotions. It is about removing access to automatic understanding. People may still see you, still hear you, still be around you, but they can no longer rely on your responses to define what those interactions mean. That loss of interpretive control creates an imbalance because influence without clarity becomes unstable. Those who once depended on reading you start to realize they are no longer interacting with a predictable emotional system. They know you're interacting with a boundary that does not translate into easy interpretation. And boundaries that cannot be interpreted cannot be easily crossed, because crossing them requires certainty, and certainty is exactly what is missing. Over time, unreadability shifts power dynamics without a single direct confrontation. It does not need to prove anything, because proof requires explanation, and explanation requires engagement. Instead, it stays incomplete in the eyes of others, always slightly beyond reach of understanding. And what cannot be fully understood cannot be fully controlled. And in that space where understanding fails, dependence begins to expose itself, because the need to decode you slowly becomes more intense than any influence they thought they had over you.